Dispatch Code 187 Alien Human Homicide. The first thing you learn about a Code 187 Alpha is that the official report is the most important piece of fiction you will ever write. My report states that Julian Croft died from a gas leak, a convenient and logical explanation for the state of the scene. It fails to mention, however, that we found him suspended 6 feet in the air, in a room that was hermetically sealed from the inside. The hiss of the tires on wet asphalt was the only sound that mattered. At 02:13, Havenwood slept under a blanket of cold, persistent drizzle that beaded on the windshield of Unit 7. Officer Kaito Tanaka ran a gloved thumb over the worn leather of the steering wheel, his patrol route a familiar loop of sleeping storefronts and darkened residential streets. It was the kind of quiet that cops in big cities dreamed of, a quiet so deep it could lull you into forgetting the uniform you wore. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee from his thermos, the bitter taste a welcome anchor in the slow, drifting current of the graveyard shift. The radio broke the silence with a crackle of static, sharp and sudden. Unit 7, come in, over. Tanaka keyed the mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Go ahead. His voice was steady, practiced. Maria, the night dispatcher, was usually a calming presence, her voice a smooth, low hum that cut through the noise. Tonight, it was thin, stretched taut over a layer of something he couldn't identify. The transmission was poor, peppered with a strange, rhythmic clicking that sounded less like atmospheric interference and more like chattering teeth. 7. We have a report of a possible 187 at 112, Willow Creek Lane. A homicide. Adrenaline sharpened the edges of Tanaka's awareness, chasing away the last vestiges of late-night fatigue. He straightened in his seat, his hand already moving toward the console to punch in the address. Copy, dispatch. A 187 at 112 Willow Creek. Is the reporting party on the line? A pause, longer than regulation. The clicking sound intensified for a moment, then subsided. Negative, 7. The call was automated. Security system alert. All subsequent attempts to make contact with the residents have met with silence. Then came the part that snagged on procedure, that ground the gears of his training to a halt. Be advised, Patrol, this is a Code 187 Alpha. I repeat, suffix is Alpha. Tanaka's fingers froze over the keyboard of his mobile data terminal. Dispatch, repeat suffix. Did not copy. In his 10 years on the force, 5 of them here in Havenwood had never heard it. There was no alpha suffix in the state penal code or the department's protocol manual. It simply didn't exist. Mariah's voice came back, strained, as if forcing the word out. Confirmed, Unit 7. The designation is Alpha. The word was followed by another burst of that strange, rhythmic static before the line cleared unnervingly. Proceed with caution. Backup is 10 minutes out. We have no visual, no contact. The premises are a black box. He stared at the NDT screen where he detyped the address. 112, Willow Creek Lane. The Croft Estate. An old, reclusive family, but not one with any flags in the system. No domestics, no priors. Just quiet money and high fences. Standard operating procedure dictated a cautious approach, waiting for backup. But the alpha suffix felt like a new rule in a game he didn't know he was playing. It felt less like a classification and more like a warning. Dispatch, copy, Tanaka finally transmitted, his own voice sounding foreign in the confines of the patrol car. Unit 7 is en route. ETA 4 minutes. He pulled the cruiser into a smooth U-turn, the red and blue lights painting the rain-slick street in silent, strobing colors. The quiet of Havenwood was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. He was driving toward a black box, armed with a non-existent code and a dispatcher's frightened voice, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the profound weight of the darkness outside his windshield. The wrought iron gates of 112, Willow Creek Lane stood slightly ajar, a silent breach in an otherwise impenetrable security perimeter. Tanaka parked Unit 7 behind the curve of the manicured hedge, killing the lights but leaving the engine running. Rain whispered against the roof as he stepped out, the air heavy with the scent of wet soil and ozone. He drew his service weapon, holding it in a low ready position, the maglite in his other hand cutting a clean, white cone through the gloom. Procedure was a comfort, a series of familiar steps in unfamiliar territory. Havenwood Police Department, he announced, his voice absorbed by the dense foliage. Announce yourself. Only the dripping of water from the eaves of the grand, two-story home answered. He approached the front door, a heavy oak structure that looked original to the house's colonial foundation. It too was unlatched, open by a mere inch. No pry marks on the jamb, no damage to the electronic lock. He pushed it open slowly, sweeping the foyer with his light. The interior was silent, immaculate. Polished marble floors reflected the beam of his flashlight like a dark mirror. He moved methodically, clearing the ground floor room by room. A library with leather-bound books arranged by color. A dining room set for a breakfast that would never be served. Everything was in its place, clean, sterile. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no chaos. It was the quietest homicide scene he had ever encountered. The only thing out of place was the cold. It grew more intense as he moved toward the great room at the back of the house, a palpable drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the night air. The great room was cavernous, with a two-story ceiling and a wall of glass overlooking a darkened garden. And in the precise geometric center of the room, there was a man. Tanaka's training provided a checklist for encountering a victim: assess for signs of life, note position, identify obvious trauma. His training failed him completely. The victim, a middle-aged man in silk pajamas, was not on the floor. He was floating. Suspended horizontally, face up, about 6 feet off the Persian rug, as if lying on an invisible table. His arms were resting at his sides, his expression was placid, almost serene. There were no wires, no supports, no tricks of light. He just hung there, a statue of flesh and bone held aloft by nothing. For a full 10 seconds, Tanaka simply stood in the doorway, his mind refusing to process the input from his eyes. He lowered his weapon, his focus shifting from a potential threat to the sheer impossibility before him. He keyed his shoulder mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I've made entry. I have one deceased male. He paused, searching for the words. Dispatch, advise all responding units this is an unsecured scene, but the circumstances are anomalous. I need forensics and the ME expedited. He holstered his weapon and took out the department-issue thermal imager. Pointing in at the body, he expected a heat signature, the fading warmth of a recent death. The imager's screen remained a deep, uniform blue. He adjusted the settings, thinking it was a malfunction, but the rest of the room registered in a normal spectrum of greens and yellows. The space occupied by and immediately surrounding the body was a void, a pocket of absolute cold so profound the imager registered it as a dead zone. The air around the floating man was visibly shimmering, like a heat haze in reverse. Tanaka began his preliminary report, his voice low and steady for the benefit of the recorder on his vest. Victim is male, Caucasian, appears to be in his late 40s. No apparent signs of lividity or rigor mortis. Position is suspended in a fixed, horizontal state. No visible means of support. He walked a slow circle around the body, his light tracing every angle. There was no blood, no wounds, not even a crease in the man's pajamas. Premises show no signs of forced entry. All windows and doors on the ground floor are secure from the interior. The scene appears otherwise undisturbed. He was logging evidence that defied physics. He was writing a report that, by any rational standard, would sound like the ravings of a man on the edge of a breakdown. Yet, it was his duty. The alpha suffix on the dispatch call echoed in his mind, no longer a mystery but a confirmation. This was something outside the manual, beyond the scope of any briefing he'd ever attended. As the first sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, Tanaka stood his ground, the sole witness in a room where the laws of nature had been summarily executed. 48 hours after the call to 112, Willow Creek Lane, the incident room was a study in futility. The large whiteboard, usually cluttered with crime scene photos, timelines, and suspect profiles, was nearly bare. A single photo of the victim, Julian Croft, was pinned to the center, surrounded by an ocean of sterile white. The case file on Officer Tanaka's desk was distressingly thin. It contained his preliminary report, a property tax record, and 2 new documents that made the whole affair even more nonsensical. The first was the forensic summary from the state lab. Tanaka read it for the 3rd time, as if repetition could conjure meaning from its void. Fingerprints. All prints recovered from the scene matched the victim, Julian Croft. No unidentified latent prints found on any surface, including primary entry points. Trace evidence comprehensive sweep yielded no foreign fibers, hairs, or soil. Dust patterns in the room were consistent with regular housekeeping, disturbed only by the footprints of first responders. DNA. All biological samples matched the victim. No foreign DNA present. Swabs of all surfaces, including doorknobs and windows, were negative for external genetic material. Electronics. Victim's phone, laptop, and home security system show no signs of external tampering. The final log entry on the security system was the automated alert sent to dispatch. The system's internal clock stopped at the exact moment of the alert 020114. No power failure was recorded. The report was a testament to a perfect crime or a perfect impossibility. It wasn't that the evidence was contradictory, it was that there was no evidence at all. The scene had been a vacuum. The perpetrator had left nothing behind because, according to the lab, no one else had ever been there. The second document was worse. Dr. Bennington, the county's chief medical examiner for 30 years, was a man of science and cynical certainty. His reports were known for their clinical precision. This one read like a page from a science fiction novel. Tanaka's eyes scanned the conclusion. Cause of death: total cellular collapse. Manner of death undetermined. Summary: the subject exhibits a condition without precedent in medical literature. Every cell in the victim's body appears to have simultaneously lost structural integrity, leading to instantaneous cessation of all biological functions. There is no indication of any known pathogen, toxin, radiation, or electrical trauma that could produce such an effect. The cellular structure resembles tissue that has undergone rapid, uniform decay, yet the time of death is estimated to be mere minutes before Officer Tanaka's arrival. We have no biological or chemical vector. We have no explanation. Tanaka closed the folder. Total cellular collapse. It was a phrase that meant nothing and everything. It was a scientific way of saying the man had simply stopped being. He leaned back in his chair, the squeak of worn vinyl loud in the quiet room. The investigation had not just stalled, it had never begun. They had a body, a location, and a time of death. Beyond that, they had only a collection of impossibilities wrapped in the official language of a police report. The press was calling it the floating man case, based on anonymous leaks. The captain was getting pressure from the mayor. And Tanaka, the primary officer on scene, had nothing to offer but a wild story that made him sound unreliable. The alpha suffix seemed less like a code now and more like a brand, marking a case that refused to conform to the known world. In 2 days, they had gone from a high-priority homicide to a bureaucratic dead end, a blank file destined for the cold case archives. The end of the shift briefing was a formality. Captain Eva Rostova stood before the board, her expression unreadable as she summarized the complete lack of progress on the Croft case. She used words like inconclusive and pending further analysis, the standard lexicon for an investigation going nowhere. She fielded a few questions from the day shift, offered no new leads because there were none, and then dismissed them. Tanaka remained in his seat, watching the others file out, the empty coffee cups and discarded notebooks they left behind a testament to a collected dead end. He was the last one in the room, aside from Rostova. She didn't look at him, instead focusing on erasing the whiteboard, wiping away the few notes that had been scrawled there until it was as blank as their case file. The squeak of the marker on the board was the only sound. "You were first on scene, Tanaka," she said, her back still to him. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Captain." "Your report was detailed." The word hung in the air, freighted with meaning. Detailed was a neutral term. It could mean thorough. It could also mean unbelievable. "I reported what I observed," Tanaka stated, his voice flat. Rostova finally turned, placing the eraser in its tray. Her eyes, a pale, weary gray, met his. She was a career cop, someone who had worked her way up from patrol in a much larger, rougher city before taking the chief's job in Havenwood. She had a reputation for being pragmatic, for cutting through nonsense. The official record shows a case with no witnesses, no suspects, and no evidence of foul play beyond a coroner's report that reads like a medical textbook as fever dream. Officially, this case goes cold at the end of the week. We don't have the resources to chase ghosts. Tanaka said nothing. He had expected this. It was the logical, procedural outcome. Rostova walked over to her desk, picked up a stack of transfer requests, and then set them down. From beneath them, she slid a small, old-fashioned brass key. She approached his table and, without a word, placed it next to his elbow. It was ornate, a skeleton key from a bygone era, polished smooth by years of handling. Some records aren't digitized, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Downstairs. Archive B. The requisition form is 7B, if anyone asks. Which they want T. She held his gaze for a moment longer, a silent understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with department regulations. Then she turned and walked out of the briefing room, leaving Tanaka alone with the key. He found the door to Archive B at the far end of the precinct's musty basement, tucked behind a decommissioned boiler. It was a heavy steel door with no window and a lock that looked a century old. It was a door he had passed 1,000 times and never once registered. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. The room smelled of dry paper, dust, and time. A single, bare bulb hung from a cord, casting a weak, yellow light over rows of gray metal filing cabinets. Unlike the main records room upstairs, there were no computers, no modern shelving units. It was an analog tomb. He ran his fingers along the cabinet drawers, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust. The labels were typed, faded, bearing dates that stretched back to the town's founding. He found the cabinet marked Unclassified Incidents. His hand hesitated before he pulled the heavy drawer open. It was filled with thick, red manila folders, each one tied with twine. He lifted the first one. The label on the tab was typed in the same blocky font as all the others, but the code was one he now recognized. Incident Report 0412-1981. Code 187A. His breath caught. He pulled another. Incident Report 0722-1954. Code 341A. A missing person. Then another. Incident Report 1102-1927. Code 459A. A burglary. Each file was appended with that impossible, non-existent suffix. These weren't just case files, they were echoes. He was standing in a library of official ghosts, a carefully curated collection of every time the laws of reality had been broken within Havenwood's town limits. This wasn't the first alpha case. It was merely the latest. The click of the door latch behind him made Tanaka spin around, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. A woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the brighter light of the basement corridor. She was lean, with dark hair pulled back severely, and her detective's shield was clipped to a belt that looked as worn as the case files. She didn't seem surprised to find him there. "You're not supposed to be in here," she said, her voice a low, even monotone. She stepped into the room, letting the heavy door swing shut, plunging them back into the dim, dusty light. "But then, nobody is." "I'm Detective Petrova." "Officer Tanaka," he replied, relaxing his posture but not his guard. "The captain." "Rostova didn't send me," Petrova interrupted, her eyes scanning the open file drawer. "She just gives people the key when the official answers stop making sense. I'm the one who files the reports. Call me the custodian." She gestured to the cabinets. "Welcome to the hush files." There was a weary resignation in her tone, the sound of someone who had accepted a difficult truth long ago. She pulled a stool from a corner, wiped the dust from it with her hand, and sat down as if she had all the time in the world. "The Croft case?" Tanaka nodded, placing the folder he held onto a nearby metal table. "It has the alpha suffix. Just like these." "They all do," she confirmed. It's not a penal code. It's a warning label. It means put it here and walk away. For the next several hours, under the weak glow of the signal bolt, they worked. Petrova seemed to know each file by heart, pulling out specific incidents with an unnerving familiarity. Together, they laid out the red manila folders on the wide table, creating a timeline of the impossible. There was the 1996 case of a librarian who would drown in her own bedroom, 3 miles from the nearest body of water. The coroner's report, filed by a younger Dr. Bennington, noted her lungs were filled with salt water and sand. The official ruling was suicide by unknown means. From 1969, a construction worker on the new town hall project who simply vanished from a steel beam 100 feet in the air, in full view of his crew. Witnesses swore he was there 1 second and gone the next. The file contained depositions describing a ripple in the air where he had been standing. The case was closed, listed as a probable walk-off. And from 1942, a farmer found in his barn, perfectly preserved but turned to obsidian like glass. The case notes speculated on a lightning strike, despite a cloudless sky. The reports were maddeningly vague, the official conclusions always mundane, always a stretch to fit the inexplicable facts into a box of rationality. But Tanaka, with a fresh perspective, noticed something else. He started arranging the files not by case type, but by date. 1996, 1969. 1942, he did the math in his head. 27 years, he said aloud, looking up at Petrova. There's a 27-year gap between each of these major incidents. Petrova gave a slow, grim nod. Give or take a few months. It's a cycle. A storm that passes through Havenwood every generation, takes 1 or 2 people, and then goes quiet again. Our job, the real job of this department's command, isn't to stop it. It's to clean up after it and keep the official story straight. This explained the blank files, the dead ends. The investigations were designed to fail. So the evidence we need won't be in here, Tanaka concluded, gesturing to the files. These are the cover-ups. Exactly, Petrova agreed, standing. The real records aren't official. They're public. Their investigation moved from the precinct basement to the town library's microfiche archives. They scrolled through decades of the Havenwood Chronicle, the screen casting a flickering green light on their faces. They weren't looking for headlines, but for the small, strange stories buried in the back pages, reports of odd weather, strange disappearances, or local eccentrics. They cross-referenced these with admission logs from the old Havenwood Asylum, whose records were stored at the County Historical Society. In the asylum logs from the week of the glass farmer incident in 1942, they found their first true connection. A patient, admitted for hysteria, was recorded as screaming about a man made of shattered night who had walked out of the corner of the barn's shadow. In the local paper from 1915, 27 years earlier, a small article detailed a hunting party that got lost in the woods, with the lone survivor claiming the trees had folded in on themselves. They were no longer investigating a single homicide. They were excavating the secret history of the town, unearthing a pattern of recurring, predatory phenomena documented not in police reports, but in the margins of local news and the desperate testimonies of those deemed insane. The research had narrowed their focus to a handful of Havenwood's founding families: the Crofts, the Wainwrights, the Delacourts. Their names were woven into the town's history, appearing on street signs, library wings, and the brass plaques of colonial-era benefactors. To dig deeper, Petrova had suggested they consult Alastair Finch, the town's semi-official historian, a man whose entire life was a meticulous archive of Havenwood's past. They had an appointment to see him at 1000 hours. The call came from dispatch at 0915. Finch's wife had reported him missing. Had gone to his private office above the town's historical society last night to work and had never come home. The door was locked from the inside, and he wasn't answering his phone. The responding patrol officer had reported a standard welfare check with no signs of foul play, but the locked room detail was enough to send a jolt of alarm through both Tanaka and Petrova. They arrived at the Historical Society to find a single patrol car out front. The building was a preserved saltbox house, its dark wood smelling of lemon oil and old paper. Finch's office was on the second floor, a cramped space overflowing with books, maps, and stacked document boxes. The patrolman, a young officer named Miller, looked relieved to see them. "Detective, officer," he greeted them. The door was bolted from the inside. "We had to take it off the hinges. Mrs. Finch is positive he didn't have a key to the bolt, said it was just for when he was working. His car is in the lot, wallet and keys are on the desk. It's like he just evaporated." The office was exactly as Miller described. A half-full cup of cold tea sat on the desk next to an open ledger. Books were neatly shelved. Nothing was disturbed. It was another sterile, impossible scene. Tanaka's gaze was immediately drawn to the room's single window, which overlooked the town square. Despite the mild autumn morning, a perfect, circular patch of frost coated the center of the glass pane from the inside. Temperature in here is 70 degrees, Petrova noted, her breath not misting. There is no reason for condensation, let alone frost. Tanaka approached the window, his gut tightening. It was the same unnatural cold he had felt at the Croft residence, but localized, contained. He leaned in closer. Etched into the center of the icy circle, as if drawn by a fine needle, was a symbol. It was a complex geometric shape, a circle containing 3 interlocking hooks, with a dot at its center. It was precise, deliberate. He pulled out his phone and took several pictures, zooming in to capture the detail. "Lena," he said, the name coming naturally now. "The NES supplemental report on Croft. The one Bennington sent you directly for the alpha file." Petrova's eyes narrowed in understanding. She knew exactly what he was referring to. The subdermal marking. He found it with the UV lamp during the secondary examination. The detail had been omitted from the official report because it couldn't be explained. Dr. Bennington had noted a faint, almost invisible mark on Croft's chest, like an old tattoo or a brand that had faded to the point of being undetectable in normal light. It only fluoresced under a specific ultraviolet frequency. He had sketched it in his notes. Petrova pulled out her own phone, navigated to a secure folder, and pulled up the image of the doctor's sketch. She held it next to Tanaka's phone. The symbols were identical. The hunter had left a calling card. This wasn't a random storm passing through town every 27 years. It was a targeted culling. Julian Croft, a descendant of a founding family. Alistair Finch, the man who was researching them. The connection was no longer a theory, it was a clear and present pattern of attack. And now, they had the killer's signature, a mark that linked the impossible disappearance of one man to the inexplicable death of another. It was the first piece of tangible, repeatable evidence they had. Back in the sterile quiet of the incident room, Tanaka pinned a photo of the symbol from Finch's window to the whiteboard. It sat next to the sketch from Dr. Bennington's report. 2 identical markers, now the twin focal points of their shadow investigation. "This changes things," Tanaka said, stepping back from the board. "We have a signature. This isn't random. It's targeted. We need to put out a bolo, start running forensics on the symbol's origin, maybe check cult databases." Petrova watched him, her expression unchanging. She moved from her chair, her hands steepled under her chin. "A bolo for vous, Kaito? A suspect who can walk through locked doors and leave frost patterns in a warm room? What are we supposed to tell forensics to look for? Metaphysical residue?" The frustration in his own voice was rising. "We have to do something, Lena. Standard procedure. We have 2 victims now. We pull the files on the founding families, put surveillance on the remaining descendants. We act." "No," she said, the word sharp and final. "We don't." She stood up and walked to the room's single window, which looked out over the station's parking lot. "You're thinking like a cop. You're trying to solve a crime. That's not what this is." She turned to face him. "This isn't a case file. It's a weather report. We're not hunting a killer. We're tracking a hurricane that touches down once every 27 years. Petrova walked over to the whiteboard and unpinned the photo of the symbol. "This isn't a signature. It's a territorial marker. Like a wolf marking a tree. It's a claim. So we just sit here and wait for it to take someone else? Tanaka countered, incredulous. We do what the custodians of the Alpha files have always done, she explained, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if the walls themselves were listening. The real protocol, the one that isn't written down anywhere. We observe. We document. And we contain the fallout. Our primary job is to keep the public from panicking. We create plausible explanations, we steer the official investigation into a dead end, and we file the real report in Archive B. That's the mandate. She let the weight of her words settle in the room. Look at the files. 1969, the construction worker. The department wrapped up a massive search and rescue operation. 2 more workers vanished in the following week. 1942, the glass farmer. The sheriff at the time brought in state investigators, treated it like a murder. His deputy had a psychotic break 2 days later, and the sheriff himself died of a heart attack before the week was out. The pattern is consistent. The more official attention we draw to these events, the more aggressive and unpredictable the phenomenon becomes. Tanaka felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The procedure he had built his entire career on, investigate, pursue, apprehend, was not just useless here, it was dangerous. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire. So your protocol is to do nothing? Our protocol is to not make things worse, she corrected him gently. Standard enforcement tactics are a provocation. They are a challenge. Imagine you're trying to deal with a radiation leak. You don't send in a SWAT team. You bring in specialists with lead suits. We, she said, gesturing between the two of them, don't have lead suits. Our job is damage control. We protect the public by ensuring this stays a quiet, inexplicable local tragedy, not a full-blown, public panic that could attract this thing's attention on a wider scale. The duty he was sworn to uphold, to protect and serve, was being twisted into a new, terrifying shape. He wasn't a hunter anymore. He was a zookeeper, and the animal was loose in the park, and his only job was to convince everyone that the roars they were hearing were just the wind. Accepting the unsanctioned protocol felt like a betrayal of his oath, but Petrova's logic, backed by a century of failed investigations, was undeniable. Their new objective was passive, to map the entity's behavior without engaging it. Tanaka suggested a town-wide review of CCTV footage, a way to observe from a safe, digital distance. They weren't looking for a suspect, but for anomalies, flickering streetlights, unexplained shadows, anything that coincided with their timeline of events. They sat in the precinct's small, chilly monitoring room, a bank of screens displaying feeds from traffic cameras, the town square, and the exterior of municipal buildings. Petrova operated the console, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she cross-referenced timestamps with Finch's disappearance and the initial call to the Croft estate. Nothing on the Historical Society's street-facing camera, she reported, her voice flat with concentration. No vehicles, no pedestrians between 2200 and 0800. It's a ghost town. Check the feed from the ATM across the square, Tanaka suggested, leaning forward. It has a wider angle. Maybe it caught something on the periphery. Petrova complied, pulling up the grainy, black and white footage. The time code in the corner of the screen read 0334. The square was empty, slick with rain. Still nothing. Just a wait. She froze, squinting at the screen. Look there. By the lamppost. Tanaka leaned closer. At the edge of the frame, partially obscured by the glare of a streetlight, there was a flicker. It wasn't a person or a car. It was a patch of visual noise, a distortion in the digital feed itself. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, a tall, thin silhouette of static that seemed to absorb the light around it. It stood perfectly still for a few seconds, then dissipated like smoke. Probably a compression artifact, Tanaka said, though the words felt hollow. Bugs in the system. Let us check another feed, Petrova replied, her voice tight. She switched to a traffic camera 2 blocks away from the Croft residence, time-stamped an hour before the initial alert. For several minutes, the feed showed nothing but the occasional passing car. Then, it appeared again. Standing at the edge of the road, almost transparent, was the same shadowy distortion. It seemed to be watching the house. A cold dread began to creep up Tanaka's spine. Pull up the dashcam footage from my unit. The approach to the Croft house. Petrova patched it through to the main screen. The footage was clearer, showing the cruiser's slow drive down Willow Creek Lane. As the Croft estate's iron gates came into view, the artifact materialized on the sidewalk. It was clearer this time, its form more defined, though it still lacked any discernible features. It was a humanoid-shaped absence in the data stream. It turned its head to follow the patrol car as it passed. They spent the next hour pulling feeds from every camera that had been in their vicinity over the past 3 days. The results were terrifyingly consistent. The static phantom was in the background of the footage from the gas station where Tanaka had stopped for coffee. It was a faint shimmer behind Petrova as she left the precinct last night. It was even present in the precinct's own exterior security feed from an hour ago, a vague, dark shape standing across the street, watching the building they were currently in. It's not just a ghost in the machine, Tanaka breathed, the scale of the revelation dawning on him. It's using the network. It's a watcher on the wire. The entity wasn't just a physical presence that appeared and disappeared. It had infested the town's electronic nervous system. They were being observed, their movements tracked, their investigation monitored through every lens and sensor in Havenwood. Their attempt to maintain a safe, observational distance was a fiction. The entity had been watching them the entire time, lurking in the very infrastructure they were using to hunt it. They weren't the observers. They were the observed. The discovery that they were being watched changed the texture of their work. Every ringing phone, every flicker of a fluorescent light, every piece of electronic equipment now felt like a potential observer. They abandoned the monitoring room and returned to the analog safety of Archive B, conducting their research surrounded by paper and ink. But if they thought disconnecting from the network would give them privacy, they were wrong. The entity simply changed its medium. It started with the police radios. A low, sibilant whisper would surface beneath the routine chatter of dispatch, too faint to be understood but clear enough to be unsettling. Officers in the field began reporting strange audio interference, particularly when patrolling the older parts of town. At first, it was dismissed as frequency bleed from a foreign station or equipment malfunction. Then it escalated. Tanaka was in the records room, cross-referencing old property deeds, when his cell phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. He answered, expecting a tip or a wrong number. There was no voice on the other end, just a chorus of layered, whispering sounds. It was a dry, rasping language that felt ancient, each word a rustle of dead leaves. The sounds were guttural, filled with clicks and drawn-out vowels that bore no resemblance to any human tongue he had ever heard. He hung up, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. A moment later, Petrova's desk phone began to ring. She looked at Tanaka, her eyes wide, and let it go to voicemail. The final breach came over the precinct's public address system. In the middle of the day shift briefing, the calm, automated voice announcing a fire drill was suddenly interrupted. The same layered, whispering chorus filled the station, rising in volume until it was a cacophony of alien syllables. It lasted for 15 seconds before cutting out, leaving behind a stunned, absolute silence. Captain Rostova calmly declared the PA system was malfunctioning and ordered the technicians to look at it, her composer a masterclass in professional detachment. But she met Tanaka's and Petrova's eyes across the room, and in that glance, they knew she understood. The entity was no longer just watching. It was speaking. Petrova managed to record one of the transmissions, a relatively clear 30-second burst that had come over her car radio. "We can't fight what we don't understand," she said, her voice grim as she played the recording in the archive room. "This isn't just noise. It's language. And language means intelligence. It means intent." She knew a linguistics professor at the State University, a man who specialized in proto-languages and obscure, dead dialects. She sent him the audio file under the guise of it being a strange deep-sea recording, a piece of anomalous audio captured by a research vessel. They couldn't risk telling him the truth. The professor, Dr. Aris Thorne, responded within a day. His email was a mixture of academic excitement and utter confusion. He confirmed it was a structured language, not random noise. He couldn't identify it, stating it had phonetic structures that predated any known human language family. He said it sounded less like a language that had evolved and more like one that was engineered, with a terrifyingly complex and efficient grammar. But he had been able to isolate a few phonemes that echoed ancient Proto-Indo-European roots, allowing for a highly speculative, fragmentary translation. He had identified a few recurring words. Mine. Trespass. Bound. Here. Thorne wrote in his email, whatever this is, it isn't threatening in a conventional sense. The tone isn't aggressive. It's declarative. These aren't threats, they're statements of fact, like reading property lines off a deed. It's a persistent, monotonous assertion of ownership. Tanaka stared at the translated words on the screen. The whispers weren't a warning to stay away. They were a notification that he, Petrova, and the entire Havenwood Police Department were trespassing on property that had been claimed long ago. EOT. The territorial claims were a chilling escalation, a shift from passive observation to active declaration. The entity was asserting its presence, and Tanaka feared it was only a matter of time before it moved beyond whispers. The test of their new, hands-off protocol came sooner than expected. A silent alarm tripped at the old Havenwood textile mill on the edge of town, a derelict building scheduled for demolition. It was likely a faulty sensor or a vagrant, but a unit had to respond. The closest was Officer Bao-chan, a rookie barely 6 months out of the academy. Tanaka and Petrova, monitoring the dispatch from the archive room, both felt a simultaneous prickle of unease. The mill was one of Havenwood's oldest structures, its foundations laid by the same families they were researching. Chan's first transmission was routine. Unit 12 to dispatch. On scene at the mill. No signs of forced entry. I'm proceeding inside to conduct a sweep. 5 minutes later, his voice came back over the radio, the professional calm replaced by a thread of confusion. Dispatch, Unit 12. This is odd. I'm on the second floor, main corridor. I've walked the length of it, but I seem to be back where I started. The exit door is gone. Say again, 12, the dispatcher requested. I'm in a loop, Chan said, his voice rising in pitch. I walk forward, I can see the end of the hall, but when I get there, I'm back at the staircase where I entered. The architecture, it's not right. Tanaka and Petrova exchanged a look of cold certainty. Get us a building schematic for that mill, now, Petrova ordered into the room's intercom, her voice hard. And patch Officer Chan's radio directly to this room. Scramble the channel. Seconds later, Chan's panicked breathing filled their small workspace. Kaito, Lena, what the hell is happening? The walls are groaning. They feel like they're getting closer. Petrova was already pulling a file from the unclassified incidents cabinet, her hands moving with frantic purpose. It was a 459A from 1915, the same year as the hunting party incident they defound in the newspaper. I remember this, she muttered, flipping through the brittle pages. An inspector got trapped during a site survey of the courthouse. The report says the building folded around him. Tanaka looked over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the handwritten notes. The investigating officer, a man named Hobbs, had written a supplemental report that was pure madness. It spoke of using lines of cold iron and a steady tone to disrupt the resonance. It was the nonsensical raving of a pre-modern mind, except they were now living it. Cold iron, Tanaka repeated, his mind racing. The old water mains under the city. They're cast iron. Get me the schematics for the water system, too. As the blueprints appeared on a nearby monitor, Tanaka saw it. A primary iron water main ran directly beneath the west side of the mill. Chen, he said into the mic, his voice a calm counterpoint to the officer's fear. Listen to me. Which direction are you facing? North, Chen stammered. Toward the loading docks. Turn around. Head south. Keep the west wall on your right. Can you do that? The walls are shifting. I don't think. Focus on my voice, bow, Tanaka commanded. Keep the west wall to your right. It's your only stable reference point. The iron main beneath you is disrupting the effect on that side of the building. He was gambling on a century-old report written by a man who likely believed in ghosts, but it was the only lead they had. Now listen, Petrova cut in, having scanned the rest of the file. The report mentions a resonant frequency. The building is vibrating at a low, inaudible level, and that's what's warping the space. We need to introduce a counter-frequency. She looked at Tanaka. Your cruiser's siren. The whale setting. It cycles through a specific range of hertz. Tanaka relayed the instructions. I've dispatched my unit to the mill, remote siren active. It will be there in 2 minutes. When you hear it, the loop might break, but it will be unstable. You need to move fast. They listened to Chen's ragged breathing for what felt like an eternity, the silence punctuated by the groaning, grinding sound of shifting architecture transmitted over the radio. Then, faintly at first, then growing louder, the familiar wail of a police siren pierced the background noise. I hear it. Chen yelled. The hallway, it's stretching. I can see the stairwell again. It's real this time. Go! Tanaka shouted. Go now! They heard Chen's running footsteps, his desperate gasps for air, and then a final, deafening crash of splintering wood and collapsing brickwork. The line went dead. For a heart-stopping moment, they thought they were too late. Then the radio crackled again, this time with the voice of the officer who had driven Tanaka's car. Dispatch, I have Officer Chen. He is outside. He is safe. The whole north wing of the mill just collapsed. In the archive room, Tanaka leaned against the filing cabinet, the adrenaline leaving him shaky. They had saved Chen, but they had done it using rules that had no place in a police manual. They had navigated a non-Euclidean labyrinth using folk magic and city planning maps. The entity wasn't just a killer, it was a master of the environment, capable of turning the solid world into a weapon. EOT. Saving Officer Chen was a victory, but a deeply unsettling one. It proved the entity was escalating its activity, moving from targeted removals to active, malicious traps. Their passive approach was no longer viable, they were now on the defensive. The question was, what had provoked this change? The cycle had been stable for generations. This time, something was different. It started with Croft, Tanaka said, pacing the cramped confines of Archive B. Everything this cycle radiates outward from that initial 187 alpha. Finch was investigating the founding families, including the Crofts. The mill was built on land originally owned by the Wainwrights, but financed by the Crofts. It all comes back to him. Petrova nodded, pulling the preliminary evidence logs from the Croft scene. We treated it as a homicide. We were looking for a perpetrator, an external actor. But what if the call came from inside the house, so to speak? They needed to re-examine the scene, not as a crime scene, but as a source. With Captain Rostova's quiet authorization, they obtained a warrant to conduct a secondary search of the Croft estate, which had been sealed since the initial investigation. Returning to 112, Willow Creek Lane felt different. The house was no longer just an impossible crime scene, it felt like the epicenter of a disease. They bypassed the pristine great room, its emptiness a silent monument to the bizarre event that had occurred there. Their focus was Julian Croft himself, his life, his habits, his secrets. His office was as immaculate as the rest of the house, the office of a wealthy man with methodical tastes. But as they searched, a pattern emerged. Behind the public-facing facade of a reclusive air, Julian Croft had been an obsessive historian and genealogist, his focus solely on his own lineage. His bookshelves were filled not with fiction or business texts, but with rare, leather-bound tomes on colonial history, local folklore, and, more disturbingly, occultism. This isn't just historical research, Petrova observed, running a gloved finger over a book titled On the Binding of Terrene Spirits. This is applied history. The breakthrough came from Tanaka. While examining a large, ornate grandfather clock in the corner of the office, he noticed the wood grain on the floor beneath it was slightly mismatched. It was a subtle imperfection in a house defined by perfection. Prying at the floorboards, he revealed a hidden compartment. Inside was a modern, fireproof safe. They called in a department locksmith, who managed to drill it open after 2 hours of painstaking work. Within the safe, there was no money, no jewelry, no deeds. There was only a single object, a thick, hand-drawn circle on a piece of aged parchment, filled with the same geometric, hook-like symbols they had seen on Finch's window. In the center of the circle was a small, dark stain. The forensics kit they brought confirmed it was human blood. Croft's blood. Cross-referencing the symbols with the occult books from Croft's library, they pieced together the horrifying truth. Croft hadn't been a victim in the traditional sense. He had been a failed celebrant. The parchment was a ritual diagram, a summoning circle, according to one text. Julian Croft, obsessed with the power his ancestors supposedly wielded, had not been targeted by the entity. He had willingly called it. His ancestors didn't just live with this thing, Tanaka surmised, the pieces clicking into place with dreadful clarity. They controlled it. They bound it here. That is the family's secret legacy. And Julian tried to replicate their success, Petrova finished, looking at the bloodstained circle. He wanted to harness that power for himself. But he got something wrong. He broke the terms of the original bargain, or maybe he just wasn't strong enough. He didn't summon a servant. He rang the dinner bell and then served himself as the first course. This was the variable that had changed the cycle. The entity wasn't just on its routine, 27-year hunt. It had been agitated, provoked by a failed attempt to master it. Croft's arrogant meddling had unlatched the cage, turning a predictable, contained predator into an active, unbound force. Their problem was suddenly infinitely larger. They weren't just weathering a storm, they were dealing with the aftermath of a catastrophic magical industrial accident. EOT. Tanaka was about to load the ritual parchment into evidence when he noticed the false bottom of the safe. It was a thin sheet of steel, barely discernible from the safe's actual floor. Prying it up with a pocket knife, he found a second, much older object nestled in the hollow space beneath. It was a book, a small ledger bound in cracked, dark leather, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The gold-leaf title on the cover was faded but legible: Havenwood Constabulary Lock Procedure, 1788. He and Petrova took the ledger back to Archive B, the one place they felt secure. They handled it with the reverence of archaeologists unearthing a sacred text. The ink was faded, the script in elegant but difficult-to-read colonial cursive. It was the duty log of Havenwood's first constable, a man named Silas Reed. The first several pages were what they expected: records of stolen livestock, disputes over property lines, arrests for public drunkenness. It was a mundane accounting of the birth of a town. Then, the entries began to change. Constable Reed started noting strange occurrences: a farmer's entire flock of sheep vanished overnight, leaving no tracks. Disembodied whispers were heard in the woods. A child claimed to have seen a man made of walking shadow. These were the first recorded encounters, the original incidents that predated the Alpha files by more than a century. But Silas Reed had not just recorded the events. He had investigated them. The latter half of the book was not a log, but a manual. It detailed, in painstaking, procedural language, his efforts to understand and combat the entity he called the Silent Trespasser. "This is not a history," Petrova breathed, her finger tracing a diagram in the book. "This is a tactical manual. A standard operating procedure." The ledger was a codex of containment. It explained that the founding families, led by the Crofts, hadn't defeated the entity. They had made a pact with it, binding it to the geographical confines of Havenwood in exchange for its cooperation. The 27-year cycle one haunted was a tax, a tithe of 1 or 2 souls to maintain the pact. Julian Croft's ritual had not been an attempt to summon the entity, but to rewrite the terms of that pact, to seize full control. His failure had broken the contract. But the ledger contained more than just the history. It contained the solution. Silas Reed, a constable faced with a threat far beyond his jurisdiction, had developed a protocol. It was a blend of his own era's law enforcement and the folk magic he had learned from local tribes and his own desperate research. The symbols weren't for summoning, they were for binding. The geometric shapes were arcane wards. The strange language was the entity's own, and specific phrases could be used as commands. The most critical section was titled Procedure for Jurisdictional Reinforcement. It was a step-by-step guide to re-establishing the boundary, to forcing the unbound entity back into its cage. It wasn't a ritual of banishment, but an act of law enforcement. It read like a police procedural written by a mystic. Step 1: Establish a perimeter of cold wrought iron. The constable noted, the trespasser cannot abide by the pure earthborn metal, for it holds no shadow in which it can hide. Step 2: The perimeter must be anchored by a warden, a figure of authority who willingly accepts jurisdiction. Authority is the only language it must obey. Step 3: The warden must issue the binding command, speaking the trespasser's own name and its terms of containment. The ledger provided the entity's name, a string of the same guttural, clicking sounds they had heard on the radio, and the precise wording of the command. They now possessed the one thing that could stop this: a weapon that was not a gun or a spell, but a set of legally and metaphysically binding instructions. They had found the original rulebook. EOT. The discovery of the ledger shifted the atmosphere in Archive B from one of dread to one of grim purpose. They had a countermeasure. Tanaka and Petrova were briefing Captain Rostova on their findings, the ancient book laid open on her desk, when the lights in her office flickered violently. A low hum vibrated through the station, the kind of deep, sub-audible frequency that precedes an earthquake. What was that? Rostova asked, her hand already reaching for the desk phone. It was dead. The hum intensified, and the computer monitor on her desk fizzled, its screen collapsing into a single, white-hot point before going dark. Then, the fluorescent light fixture directly above them exploded in a shower of glass and sparks, plunging the office into the dim, gray light of the late afternoon. This was not a power surge. This was an attack. It knows, Petrova said, her voice tight with alarm as she instinctively moved to shield the ledger. It knows we found the book. A chorus of shouts and surprised yells erupted from the main bullpen outside Rostova's office. Tanaka drew his weapon and pushed the door open, his senses on high alert. The main precinct floor was in chaos. Lights were shattering one by one, casting the room in a strobe-like effect of failing electricity and emergency lighting. The air crackled with ozone, and the temperature was plummeting. The metal evidence lockers that lined the far wall began to groan and buckle, their steel doors warping as if under immense, invisible pressure. One of them burst open, its contents tagged in bagged evidence from dozens of unrelated cases spewing across the floor. The heavy steel door of the armory began to glow a dull, cherry red before its locking mechanism audibly snapped. Then, with a deafening clang that echoed through the building, the emergency lockdown shutters slammed down over the main entrance and all windows. The heavy, rolling steel doors designed to protect the precinct from a riot were now sealing them inside. A final, definitive thump signaled the magnetic locks on all exterior doors engaging. The Havenwood police precinct had become a tomb. "This is a breach of jurisdiction," Rostova declared, her voice cutting through the rising panic of the other officers. She was no longer just a police captain, she was the commander of a besieged fortress. "All personnel, tactical alert. Form up in the center of the bullpen. Stay away from the walls and electronics." The entity was no longer a phantom in the machine or a whisper on the wire. It was a physical, malevolent force, and it had just taken control of their headquarters. The whispers started again, not from any speaker, but from the very air around them, a cacophony of overlapping, territorial claims spoken in its alien tongue. The shadowy, humanoid distortion they had seen on the CCTV feeds began to bleed through the walls, dozens of them, tall, featureless silhouettes of pure static that observed the trapped officers from the periphery. They were trapped. The police, the figures of authority and order, were locked inside their own building with a being that operated on a set of laws far older and more powerful than their own. The hunter had become the prey, cornered in its own den. EOT. Panic was a contagion, and it was spreading fast among the dozen officers trapped in the bullpen. Some were drawing their weapons, aiming at the shimmering, static apparitions that flickered at the edges of the room. Their bullets passed through the shapes with no effect, embedding themselves in the walls with loud, futile cracks. "Hold your fire." Tanaka's voice boomed, amplified by years of command training. It's not a physical target. You're wasting ammo and risking ricochet. With Rostova's nod of approval, he and Petrova took charge, turning the chaotic bullpen into a staging area. The Colonial Ledger was their new rulebook. The constable's manual, Tanaka announced, his voice a bastion of calm in the storm. It gives us a procedure. We need to establish a perimeter of coal iron. Iron? What are you talking about, Tanaka? One of the older sergeants demanded, his face pale in the emergency lighting. Downstairs, Petrova cut in, her tone sharp and direct. The maintenance workshop. They have a metal grinder. There should be buckets of iron filings from sharpening tools and cutting rebar. We need it. All of it. Now. Two of the younger, faster officers were dispatched, running down the corridor that, for now, remained stable. While they were gone, Tanaka and Petrova turned the bullpen into a command center. They gathered the remaining portable radios, the only communication equipment still functioning on their independent battery power. The book says the entity cannot abide by the pure earthborn metal, Petrova explained to the assembled, bewildered officers, pointing to a passage in the ledger. It acts as a barrier. A physical line it cannot cross. We are going to draw that line here, around the central desks. The two officers returned, hauling two heavy plastic buckets filled with coarse, dark metal shavings. This is it, one of them panted. Everything they had. Under Tanaka's direction, they began to pour a thin, unbroken line of the iron filings on the floor, creating a wide circle that encompassed the core of the bullpen and all the trapped personnel. As the line of dark metal dust neared completion, the shadowy figures that had been pressing in from the walls seemed to recoil, their forms distorting as if hitting a current of invisible energy. The oppressive cold in the room lessened perceptibly within the circle. It's working, an officer whispered in disbelief. It's only a temporary barrier, Tanaka warned. Step 2 requires us to anchor it. He looked at the ledger, then back at the officers. Constable Reed's notes state that the perimeter must be reinforced with verbal commands. The entity is bound by a specific hierarchy of authority. It's a legalistic creature. We need to assert our jurisdiction. He handed out the portable radios, instructing each officer to tune to a single, shared frequency. The ledger lists specific phrases, he said. Petrova is going to read them aloud. Your job is to repeat them, in unison, over the radio. We create a chorus of command, a broadcast of authority that it cannot ignore. We're not just cops anymore. We are all deputies in this action. We are the wardens of this circle. Petrova keyed the mic on her radio, her voice clear and steady despite the chaos. She began to recite the strange, guttural words from the book, enunciating each alien syllable with precision. By the authority vested in this place. She began in English, before switching to the entity's own tongue. A moment of hesitation, then, one by one, the other officers keyed their own mics. A dozen voices, united and amplified by the radio waves, began to chant the arcane, procedural language. The sound filled the room, a strange fusion of a police dispatch and an ancient exorcism. The whispers from the entity faltered, overwhelmed by the unified broadcast of command. The static figures at the edge of the room flickered and grew thin, pushed back by the wall of sound and the line of iron. They had turned their standard-issue equipment into tools of ritual. They had deputized their entire shift into a containment unit. They weren't fighting it with bullets, but with bureaucracy and the sheer, overwhelming assertion that this precinct, this circle of iron, was their territory, and it was not welcome. EOT. The combined effect of the iron line and the chorus of broadcasted commands created a pocket of fragile stability inside the bullpen. The static apparitions had retreated, now little more than faint distortions visible in the corridors beyond. The groaning of stressed metal had ceased, and the oppressive cold had been replaced by the normal, stale air of the precinct. They had a reprieve. Tanaka stood on a desk in the center of the circle, the Colonial Ledger in his hand. The faces of his fellow officers looked up at him, their expressions a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and dawning acceptance of their impossible situation. This was no longer a normal shift. This was a siege. "All right, listen up," Tanaka began, his voice carrying across the quiet bullpen. This was the final briefing. "What we've done here is temporary. It's a holding action. We've established a perimeter, but we haven't resolved the threat. This thing is still in the building, and it's still unbound." He opened the ledger to a bookmarked page, its diagram showing a series of concentric circles and symbols. "According to Constable Reed, we can't kill it. We don't have the means, and based on his notes, attempting to do so would be catastrophic. Our objective is not destruction. It's containment. We need to reinstate the contract that Julian Croft broke." He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of each officer. The ledger outlines a final procedure. It calls it jurisdictional reinforcement. Think of it as re-signing a treaty. We are going to force this entity back into its previous state of dormancy. We put it back in its cage and lock the door for another 27 years. Petrova stepped forward, continuing the briefing. "The procedure requires two components. First, the binding symbols need to be drawn on the floor of the precinct's main hall, which the book identifies as a place of communal authority. We'll use chalk from the evidence kits. Second, the ritual must be anchored by a central figure. The book calls this person the warden." A heavy silence fell over the group. The word warden hung in the air, its implications clear. "The warden acts as the signatory on the new contract," Tanaka explained, his tone grave. "They are the focus of the entire ritual. They must willingly accept jurisdiction over the entity, becoming its symbolic jailer. By doing so, they channel the energy of the binding. According to this," he tapped the book, "the process creates a backlash. The constable describes it as a terrible psychic weight. It's not a physical risk, but the warden will bear the brunt of forcing this thing back into compliance." He let them absorb that. He wasn't asking for a volunteer for a dangerous mission, he was asking for someone to take a bullet that wasn't made of lead. This was about more than courage. It was about sacrifice. "This is not an order," Captain Rostova said, her voice cutting through the tension. She had been standing quietly at the edge of the circle, observing, her authority a silent, steadying presence. "Everything we are doing here tonight is outside the bounds of any manual you have ever read. No one will be compelled. But this entity has breached our house. It has targeted our officers. It is a direct threat to the public we are sworn to protect. We will not let it break this department. We will end this, tonight." Her words solidified their resolve. They were no longer just victims, trapped and afraid. They were a single unit, with a clear, albeit terrifying, objective. The final briefing was over. All that remained was to choose the warden and execute the plan. EOT. Before anyone else could speak, Captain Eva Rostova stepped into the center of the circle. "The warden must be a figure of authority," she stated, her voice resonating with finality. "As commander of this precinct, that authority is mine. The duty is mine." There were murmurs of protest, but she silenced them with a raised hand. There was no arguing with the logic or with the quiet, unyielding command in her eyes. The decision was made. The team moved with the coordinated precision of a well-drilled unit. Leaving the relative safety of the bullpen, they advanced to the precinct's main lobby, a large, open hall with a high ceiling. The iron filings they had were not enough to encircle this much larger space, so their only protection would be the ritual itself. As a team of officers began hastily drawing the complex series of symbols from the ledger onto the tile floor with bright yellow crime scene chalk, the entity's presence intensified. The air grew frigid, and the whispers returned, no longer just a background noise but a furious, overlapping roar of protest from all directions. The emergency lights began to flicker and fail, plunging them into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the beams of their flashlights. The building groaned around them, the sound of stressed concrete and twisting steel echoing through the halls. The perimeter was collapsing. "Stay focused," Tanaka commanded, his voice cutting through the din. "Finish the symbols." As the final chalk line was drawn, connecting the circle, a profound silence fell. The whispers ceased. the groaning of the building stopped. In the center of the hall, Captain Rostova stood, her service weapon holstered, her posture erect. She was the anchor. "Begin the recitation," she ordered, her voice betraying no fear. Petrova stood just outside the chalk circle, the ledger held open in her trembling hands, a flashlight beam illuminating the ancient text. She began to read the binding command, the long, guttural string of syllables that was the entity's true name. As she spoke, the air in the center of the circle began to shimmer, and the air around Rostova grew distorted, like a heat haze. Tanaka and the other officers stood at cardinal points on the circle's edge, their weapons drawn, though they knew they were useless. Their role was to bear witness, to lend their authority to their captain's sacrifice. As Petrova finished the recitation of the name, the entity manifested. It was not the shadowy silhouette from the cameras. It was a vortex of non-light in the center of the room, a Terran reality that absorbed all illumination, a seething, silent patch of absolute blackness that coalesced directly in front of Rostova. Rostova did not flinch. She looked directly into the void and spoke the final lines of the binding command, her voice ringing with the full weight of her office. "By the authority of this precinct, by the oath of its officers, you are bound. You will return to your dormancy. You will keep the pact. This is my jurisdiction. This is my command." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the vortex imploded. A wave of force, silent and invisible, erupted outwards. The remaining lights in the building shattered. The plate glass windows of the lobby disintegrated into a million pieces. The heavy steel lockdown shutters were ripped from their mountings and thrown across the street. Every officer was thrown from their feet by the sheer power of the blast. When the dust settled, Tanaka pushed himself up, his ears ringing. The entity was gone. The oppressive cold was gone. The whispers were gone. The air was still and clear, smelling of dust and ozone. The chalk circle on the floor was now a scorched, black ring burned into the tiles. In the center of it, Captain Rostova was still standing. But her eyes were vacant, staring into a distance no one else could see. A single trickle of blood ran from her nose. She was conscious, breathing, but utterly unresponsive. The terrible psychic weight Constable Reed had written about had descended upon her, and in saving her precinct, she had paid the price. The official report, filed the next morning, was a masterpiece of plausible fiction. A faulty gas main in the basement had ruptured, causing a concussive blast that explained the structural damage. Captain Rostova, a hero who had evacuated her officers, had suffered a severe stroke in the aftermath, brought on by the stress of the incident. She was transferred to a long-term care facility, her career over, her sacrifice known only to the handful of officers who had stood with her in the circle. EOT. In the weeks that followed, the Havenwood Police Department operated out of a temporary headquarters set up in the town hall's gymnasium. The official story of the gas main explosion held a convenient narrative that explained away the shattered building and the sudden, tragic end to a respected captain's career. The town mourned Rostova, lauded her as a hero, and moved on, comforted by the logical, if unfortunate, explanation. The quiet of Havenwood was restored. Kaito Tanaka, now acting captain, sat at a borrowed desk under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gymnasium, the rhythmic squeak of basketball shoes from the other side of a temporary divider a constant reminder of the normal world he no longer fully inhabited. In front of him were two reports. The first was the official closing summary of the Julian Croft case, Incident Log 4A187. He had written it himself, every word a carefully constructed lie designed to protect the public from a truth they could not handle. The report concluded that Julian Croft, suffering from an undiagnosed psychotic disorder and paranoid delusions rooted in his family's history, had engineered his own death using a complex, self-designed apparatus involving acoustic resonance and cryogenics. The disappearance of Alistair Finch was attributed to Croft as well, a final act of violence before his suicide. The events at the precinct were a direct result of a compromised gas line, a tragic coincidence. It was neat, logical, and utterly false. It was a perfect piece of fiction. He signed the bottom of the report, his signature making it the official truth. The second report was the real one. It was a thick file, typed by Petrova and himself. It contained everything: his initial observations at the Croft house, the discovery of the Alpha files, the 27-year cycle, the entity on the wire, the impossible architecture, the colonial ledger, and a full, detailed account of the binding ritual and Restova's sacrifice. It was the truth, every unbelievable word of it. The cover page was simple, typed in the same blocky font as all the others that came before it: Incident Report 10/28/2023. Code 187A. Late that night, long after the rest of the department had gone home, Tanaka took the brass key Restova had given him and walked to the condemned precinct building. It was cordoned off with yellow tape, a dark, silent shell of what it once was. He let himself in, his flashlight beam cutting through the profound darkness. He made his way to the basement, to the heavy steel door of Archive B. The room was untouched by the blast, a silent, dusty testament to the secrets it held. He opened the unclassified incidents cabinet and placed his and Petrova's true report at the very back of the drawer. Next to it, he placed the colonial ledger of Constable Silas Reed, returning it to the darkness. His report was now part of the cycle, another layer in the secret history of this town, waiting for the next custodian who would need it in 27 years. He closed the drawer, the sound of metal sliding on metal unnaturally loud in the silence. As he stood there, he felt the full weight of the duty that had been passed to him. It was a silent, thankless, and lifelong post. He was no longer just a police officer. He was a keeper of the peace in a way he had never imagined, the warden of a pact made centuries ago. He was the protector of a town that would sleep soundly, never knowing the true nature of the storm that had just passed, or the thin, fragile line of duty and sacrifice that kept the real darkness at bay. Turning off his flashlight, he walked out of the archive, locking the door behind him. He did not look back. We began with the impossible image of a man suspended by nothing, and we end with an entire town held up by a single, necessary lie. The piece in Havenwood was bought with the captain's mind and the ink of a redacted log. It reminds us that the truest acts of protection are often the ones that will never be recorded or understood. These are the kinds of entries we unseal here at Keeper of the Dark Logs. It leaves us with the heavy question of leadership. When Captain Restova volunteered as the warden, was that her absolute duty as a commander, or should she have allowed another officer to make that sacrifice? Until the next file is opened, stay vigilant. Next time, we'll examine a redacted log from a town that wasn't so lucky, a town that never found its codex of containment.